Assalamu alaikum everybody, this is Sean with the Muslim Vibe reporting from ISNACON, which is the Islamic Society of North America's annual convention. And I'm here with our guest, Dr. Craig Considine. A little bit about our guest: he is a scholar, global speaker, media contributor, and public intellectual based at the Department of Sociology at Rice University. Dr. Considine is a Catholic of Irish and Italian descent. He's gotten his BA from American University in Washington, D.C., and his PhD from Trinity College at the University of Dublin. So without further ado, I read a quote on your website, and it was really interesting. So I just wanted to read this to you and have you expand on it. You said, "I am the descendant of Christians, both Catholic and Protestant, but I consider my religion to be humanity. When it comes time for me to practice religion and worship God, I roll with Catholicism." Break that down. How does that work?
Well, I think first and foremost, before I'm a Christian, and before I fit into that narrow category, I identify myself first as a human being. I'm a person. I have blood in my veins, and I have a heart, and I have an organ just like anyone else.
Yeah.
So I say that, and I put the emphasis on humanity to remind people that before we fit into these rigid identity categories, which are useful at some time, at some point, but first and foremost, I'm concerned about humanity, and for my way of connecting to humanity is Christianity. But I say that in terms of practices. Like when it comes time for me to say, okay, something happens. I mean, at some point I'm going to leave this earth. I'm going to pass away, and when that happens, it's going to be a Catholic ceremony, right? When my child is born, God willing, we have a baptism, right? And, stuff like that. So when it comes time for me to pray, I use Catholic prayers. But that's a personal thing. We are connected to something much larger than our religions.
Totally. Yeah, definitely that personal relationship with God is something that's common across religions and even in irreligion.
Yeah.
So how did you get to that point where you sort of saw the benefit in this plurality?
Wow, that's a good question, because that's like a kind of moment in time.
Yeah.
I think there was never kind of a eureka moment where it's just like, wow, now I've figured it out. It was a process that happened over a long period of time. And it's still happening too. We're constantly experiencing things and having new understandings and meeting new people. But I think over time it was largely my interaction, my exposure and engagement with Muslims and the Islamic tradition. That's when I kind of started seeing myself as part of a bigger picture. It wasn't just Christians, and you don't have to isolate yourself and divide. I started thinking, man, wow, so we're actually part of the same tradition, right? So there's Jews and Christians and Muslims and
Abrahamic faiths.
The Abrahamic tradition. I was like, they don't teach us that in Catholic school, right?
Yeah.
They don't teach us about, Abraham and some of these really important historical moments. So, it happened, this kind of understanding happened over a long time,
Okay.
A long time.
And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven the second time, and said, By myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned unto his young men, and they rose up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba.
Did you find there were any barriers, obviously coming from a Christian background and seeing Islam, and there are some things that are, a little different. Did you find any barriers in, like, I guess, getting comfortable with seeing yourself as kind of like that larger faith community with Christians and Jews?
Yeah, you know, I mean, naturally, because
Yeah.
I grew up in a town in Needham, Massachusetts, 30,000 people, never met a Muslim. There's no mosques in town.
Okay.
I never met a Muslim until I was 19 or 20.
Wow.
So when that process started, you know, there was a not a struggle, but a learning process that had to happen.
Yeah.
And it was mainly like religious literacy, you know, like understanding, even something like, take your shoes off before you walk into a prayer space in a
Right.
masjid, you know,
Yeah.
stuff like that. And then, there was that familiarity process. And then when you start mixing like culture and religion, which often happens too, I found
Yeah.
myself, right, so if I'm spending the weekend with like a Turkish community versus like a Pakistani community.
You're going to get a different experience.
Right,
Yeah.
and like you have to be culturally literate
Right.
as well. So, yeah, I mean, it's a process, and honestly, it's still happening. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, it's not like I never, rub someone the wrong way. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
human. I'm not perfect, and I don't
Sure.
understand everything. But, but that's what it means. If you're engaging in the process of allyship, and I explain to my students, allyship is not a label. It's not an identity term. It's a process, and you have to be willing to get uncomfortable. You have to be willing for someone to tell you, hey, that's wrong, or that's not what we do here,
Right.
and like, you got to humble yourself. And if you start concerning, someone tells you, hey, don't do this in the masjid, and you're like, oh man, this person got really mad at me. So
Right.
your ego is actually the problem here. If you really cared about allying yourself to another community, you would take the criticism and you would digest it and say, okay, if I'm here to learn, I'm going to listen to these people. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally.
Now, Hail Caesar is a prestige picture, our biggest release of the year, and we're devoting huge resources to its production in order to make it first class in every respect. Gentlemen, given its enormous expense, we don't want to send it to market except in the certainty that it will not offend any reasonable American regardless of faith or creed. Now that's where you come in. You've read the script. I want to know if the theological elements of the story are up to snuff. As for the religious aspect, does the depiction of Christ Jesus cut the mustard?
Well, the nature of Christ is not quite as simple as your photoplay would have it.
How so, Father?
It's not the case simply that Christ is God or God Christ.
You could say that again. The Nazarene was not God.
He was not God.
He was a man.
Part God.
No, sir.
Rabbi, all of us have a little bit of God in us, don't we?
Well, it's the foundation of our belief that Christ is most properly referred to as the Son of God. It's the Son of God who takes the sins of the world upon himself so that the rest of God's children, we imperfect beings, through faith, may enter the kingdom of heaven.
So God is split?
Yes and no.
There is unity in division.
And division in unity.
I'm not sure I follow, Padre.
Young man, you don't follow for a very simple reason. These men are screwballs. God has children? What, and a dog? A collie, maybe? God doesn't have children. He's a bachelor and very angry.
No, he used to be angry.
What, he got over it?
You worship the God of another age.
Who has no love.
Not true. He likes Jews.
God loves everyone.
God is love.
God is who is.
This is special? Who isn't who is?
But how should God be rendered in a motion picture?
God isn't in the motion picture.
Then who?
That's cool. So you talked about this process, and one of the things you brought up, cultural literacy, very important. And I feel like, well, a lot of people actually feel that there's a sort of clash of civilizations between the East and the West, especially with a lot of the rhetoric that you hear on the media. How can we build those bridges of cultural literacy, both from the East to the West and vice versa?
Vice versa, absolutely.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, Sean, as you mentioned, the clash of civilization appears to be winning.
Yeah.
And 9/11 gave it completely new life. Before I get into how to get through this, I mean, I love the term the dialogue of civilizations. It's
Yeah.
the exact opposite, right? So you could be a historian or someone quite picky and go back into history and say, well, what about the Crusades?
Right.
Well, yeah, but what about the other times in which civilizations were in harmony with one
Yeah.
another and
Yeah.
synthesizing, right?
Yeah.
So we have the ability as humans, we have minds, we can choose certain theories or concepts to roll with. Like
Yeah.
we can only focus on the class of civilizations and be pretty negative and dreary, or we can do something more productive. So
Middle Eastern Christians ate with Muslims, married Muslims, bequeathed estates to Muslim heirs, taught Muslim children, and were soldiers in Muslim armies. Writings from these ancient Middle Eastern Christians even depict a particularly amorphous nature of what we call Islam, suggesting that in the first centuries after Muhammad's death, there was much greater overlap between the categories, Christian and Muslim, than commonly acknowledged.
To start the process, I have a term, it's an acronym, and it's called DEUCE.
Deuce.
It's like a peace sign, right?
Yep.
And it stands for dialogue, education, understanding, commitment, and engagement, right?
Okay.
So to start this process, doing what we're doing right now, talking.
Yep.
And I often encourage people to talk over food. If you feel comfortable with them in your home, do it in your home.
Mm-hmm.
Don't talk about religion.
Yeah.
Talk about family, what it's like to be a human.
Yeah.
Break the ice. Education. Once you're chill with someone, it's like, all right, let's get out the Qur'an. What about this verse? Or let's bring out the Bible. It's like, well, what does this mean, right?
Yeah.
Once you do that, then you can start understanding, right? You can get past the clash of civilizations, dichotomy, and the media coverage that expresses this dichotomy.
Because you've acknowledged each other's humanity in the deep part. Yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right? So you got the dialogue, you got the education, you got the understanding. Once you have the understanding, it's like, yeah, we got it now, right?
Yeah.
Now we can commit. You and I can work on the same team, and
Yep.
once you have that understanding, then you go out and you engage,
Yeah.
and you do it.
Yeah.
You do it together,
Yeah.
and that's what has to be stressed, right? You do it together, right? So.
Every Friday inside this historic church, there's a call to prayer answered by hundreds of Muslims surrounded by Christian icons. For Bond, the church has become more than just a place to pray.
Look at that. I'm not Christian, but look at that. That's beautiful.
And during the prayers, we heard a sound, church bells.
It's amazing, it's amazing to see two things together. Who can imagine, church bells ringing and a Muslim giving a sermon? It's a moment of reflection for people who think that we are different.
Even something like outside, the counter-protest that's outside, like you have people of all different faiths committing to certain core principles about what it means to live in a country like the United States, and they're doing it together, and that's much more powerful than just Muslims being out there as a counter-protest.
Yeah. Very interesting, actually. Right before this, we were out there, and we decided to go and shake hands with the Trump supporters. We had a very good dialogue that we never would have had if we were just protesting against them. So the conclusion that we came to is, hey, if all of us who are on both sides of these protests actually just sat down, literally what you just described.
Yeah, I mean,
so in action, we literally it works.
And I think there's something's been happening, and I'm 34 years old. This may be something that's happened for eternity, but it feels like we're at this spot now where we can't even talk.
Yeah.
We can't even talk to one another civilly.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think it's fear, to be honest. I think it's fear that is the driving factor. Because if you're literally afraid or hesitant to go up to someone because they look a certain way, we got some serious ish.
For real.
Definitely. And we got to find a way to just be human.